It's not a huge deal. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I can record. I just started.
Awesome. The co-president of IBA wanted to have access to it afterwards. Thought he would be here. I'll give him like a minute or two more, and then we can go ahead and move on. So Blaine, just to give you a heads up on the intro side of things, I'm just going to say a quick thank you to everybody. I'll just give a brief explanation of PGN and what we do, just because we are going to have a lot of unfamiliar faces in here tonight. If Trevor gets in here in time, I'll give him a second to explain IBA, and then I'll give you just a quick, explaining, you're Blaine, graduating 2011, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. And then I'll let you take it and do whatever you want.
Okay. When was the last speech like this that you guys had done? Like, is it every couple weeks or every?
So we had a professional development one with Enterprise 2 weeks ago, I believe it was. And that was over networking and some other stuff along those lines. But we haven't really had anything like this informal and just kind of like about a person yet. So this will be a little bit of a different style.
Okay.
And then are you good with people just dropping their questions in the chat box like while the presentation is going on, or do you want them to wait until the end?
No, I'm fine with dropping them in the chat box, but let me just see, where is the chat? Okay, here we go. Yeah, okay, I've got the chat box up here. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
or otherwise, I mean, yeah, you can drop them in the chat box, or we can just kind of, well, yeah, no, that's probably the easiest. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and just let everybody in, and we'll go ahead and get started then.
Okay.
All right. Thank you guys all for coming tonight. We are going to have Blaine Curcio. He is a 2011 ISU graduate from the international business side. Blaine is a space and aerospace analyst and consultant, and he's based out of Hong Kong. This is going to be a 30-minute presentation followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. Whenever you guys have questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat, and Blaine will either address them while he's talking, or he will wait until the Q&A session to begin addressing them. We'll kind of let him go with whatever he wants. But I'm just going to give you guys a quick explanation of PGN and what we are. We've got a lot of unfamiliar faces out here. So we are a professional development organization. We're focused on giving our members opportunities to build their professional skill set. We do a lot of resume critiques, interview skills, and networking opportunities just like this. This specific presentation is a part of a semester-long speaker series, and our next event will be held in November. We're looking at either the 11th or the 18th, and that will be a speaker panel with representatives from Kraft Heinz, the National Futures Association, and West Point Financial Group. So Blaine, I will go ahead and let you take it away.
Cool. Thank you, Logan. And everyone can hear me? Yeah. Okay. So thank you all for your time. It's good to see so many people on Zoom. This is the most people that I've probably had on a call that I'm moderating, so that's cool. My name is Blaine Curcio, and I'm here to talk about 5 ideas for the next 10 years, with the idea being that I'm about 10 years out of ISU, and I've had a little bit of time to kind of think about what are some of the lessons that I've learned in my first decade of being a graduate. So hoping to provide some food for thought. So a little bit about myself. As Logan mentioned, my name is Blaine Curcio, ISU International Business Program, class of 2011, and I completed my MBA last year in Hong Kong. I've been spent 10 years mostly working in the space and satellite industry, and mostly in Asia Pacific. And during my time at ISU, I did International Business Club. I did a study abroad program. I did what was called the National Student Exchange, which I don't know if they still have, but I hope they do. I did a student export project, and I did an international internship during my time at ISU. So just a quick overview of the 5 thoughts that I want to talk about today. So invest often and with a strategy, recognize the changing macro environment. This is not remotely like the dot-com bubble. The labor markets are flattening. It helps not to just be labor, and embrace probability-based flexibility. And as some of you may recognize, there's a lot of, there's some very broad statements here. And so I will try to be as anecdotal and specific as possible while trying to keep the lessons quite broad, because I think it's a helpful way of making them applicable. So let's get started. Talking about investing often and with a strategy. So full disclosure, I started to really try to save money and invest around age 27, which I guess for a lot of you sounds like a very, very long time from now. And for me, it sounds like a rather long time ago. But one thing that I certainly wish I had done is start saving and investing at an earlier age. I know it's my second bullet point, but I'm going to read it first because I think it makes the most sense to read it first. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and on this podcast, they said, if you had invested $2,000 per month, every month from age 19 to age 26, and then did not touch that money until age 65, if you got 10% per year return on that money for the 45 years, so from age 19 to age 65, you get 10% return on that money. So that's scenario A, is put 2,000 a month from age 19 to 26. Scenario B is 2,000 a month from age 27 to 65. The 10% compound interest, it ends up that the person who invested 2,000 per month from age 19 to age 26 has more money at age 65, having not invested any more money from age 26 to age 65. And when I heard that, I immediately kind of was skeptical, and I did the math, and it's correct. Apparently, that initial having invested 7 years earlier is that big of a factor. And it was really kind of a mind-blowing thing. And so I know that they say, invest early, and it's a cliche, but really it hit home for me at that point. So I suggest to all of you to as soon as you start making money, start to save some money. The second part of the top here with the strategy, I think though is equally important. You're all very young. Invest in companies that are going to grow. Learn about investing. Learn how to manage your own money. This is one thing that I have spent a lot of time doing, and I personally think it's a good thing to do. Is to just learn how to manage money, learn how to have a feel for your own risk tolerance, learn how to look at different asset classes and see how they fit in with your life plan. Try to diversify your money. So I made a kind of a brief pie chart as kind of a personal exercise before this talk, and looking at sort of my own asset allocation. And I as you see, I have some money in gold and cryptocurrencies and in different equities and real estate. And I think it's a good way of trying to make sure that your eggs are not all in one basket, is to diversify. And again, it does not require a huge amount of money every month. It does not require a huge amount of diligence, but definitely invest early and invest with a strategy. And if I were you, I would be investing in growth, tech companies, because I do think that's a big topic moving forward, and we will get to that more in just a few minutes. So idea 2, recognize the change in macro environment. I put this chart here of US, China, and Russia GDP over the last 30 something years, there's a couple of points to take away. So people today are talking a lot about US and China and the sort of strategic adversary relationship that the two countries have. And you also hear a lot of comparisons to the late 1980s and the Soviet Union and the Cold War, this kind of thing. And the first takeaway from this chart is if we look at like the size of the Russian economy in the late 80s compared to the US economy, the Russian economy was dramatically smaller. And if we look at China today, I know that well, I guess on my screen, the videos are kind of in the way, but if we look at China today compared to the US, it's like 70% of the size of the US economy. And I think it's an important distinction to make that this is unprecedented in recent memory. Like the last time we've had a situation where there was a global power that was being so directly challenged by an emergent power, it would have certainly been probably whenever you would define as the time that the US overtook the UK as the most powerful country in the world. I mean, that would have been well before any of our lifetimes. And so it's an important thing to recognize that this is not a trend that's going away. I think we're going to continue to see the world split into a kind of US and a Chinese camp. And this is going to primarily be seen in terms of like geopolitics, but also in terms of things like technology. So increasingly, you're going to have 5G networks that are built by Huawei and ZTE. And on top of those networks, you're going to have mostly apps that are built by Chinese companies. And then you will have on the other side 5G networks that are built by Ericsson or other Western companies, and you're going to have Western infrastructure built on top of that. And this is going to cause some countries to become, like basically a lot of countries I think are going to have to choose. And for some countries, it will be a very obvious choice. So for example, Australia is very unlikely to be using a lot of Chinese equipment. Pakistan is unlikely to be using Western equipment. But you're going to see this increased kind of bipolar nature of the world. And China has been growing really fast for a long time. They're still very far behind the US in a lot of areas, but they are also kind of leading in a lot of areas. So things like fintech, things like mobile payments, things like smart cities. There's a lot of things where China is actually doing really, really well. And part of it is because of their government structure and the way their economy is set up and sort of the incentives that exist in their system. And there are a lot of areas that they will continue to do well. There's an excellent book that I would recommend every single one of you to read. It's called AI Superpowers by a Taiwanese computer scientist called Kai-Fu Lee. He used to work at Google and Microsoft, and now he's a venture capitalist. But he talks about how in China, you have so much data and so much of an openness by people to have their data collected and analyzed that like a lot of different AI research areas that are based on having huge data sets, so like machine learning, this kind of thing, these are areas that China is likely to have at least a distinct advantage in the sense that they just have a lot more data and a lot more willingness to collect that data. And so digressing, you've seen China grow very fast over the last, say, 30 years, primarily by catching up to the West in industrial terms, and then increasingly because they've had a lot of really innovative technology. I think moving forward, you're going to see that really innovative technology part be a bigger portion of China's growth. And again, I think as an American, that is significant because there's going to be more strategic competition between these two countries, and there's going to be opportunities to try to be in between. I hope that's kind of where I make my living, but in general, I think this is not a passing trend, this changing macro environment. And I think the biggest takeaway, again, if just thinking about in the context of our lifetime, so someone who's been born in the last 20 or 30 years, the biggest takeaway is that we're moving from what has historically in our lifetimes been a unipolar world, a monopolar world, just the US as being sort of the only real superpower. And we are now going to be increasingly in a bipolar world where you have the US and you have China. And ultimately, and this is more kind of in my opinion, we are arguably moving into what would be a multipolar world because we have now these tech titans that are so big. And that is my next topic, which is that this is not remotely like the dot-com bubble, and this is also not remotely investment advice. So this is don't literally take my word for this, but a little bit of context. So for the last like year, we've seen the Nasdaq has increased massively from the trough in March until now, or even over the last 5 years, we've seen this huge increase in tech stock valuations. And a lot of analysts have been saying this is kind of like the dot-com bubble, like that we're going to see these tech companies collapse at some point. I would definitely disagree. So if you're looking at companies like Amazon or Apple right now, their market cap is almost $2 trillion. Apple's more than $2 trillion. Amazon and Apple, both of their revenues are like 400 billion US dollars per year. These are like small countries right now, and they're growing at like 30% a year. Well, Amazon is growing 30% a year. And again, I mean, this is unprecedented. Like there have never been, like there have been really powerful companies in the past. I read earlier this year a really good book on the British East India Company and sort of what they had done in India in the 1800s. And that's an example of a nation state company, essentially. But I do think that today we're getting back to that point. You have tech companies that are literally becoming more powerful than nation states. And that's quite significant. I think that's going to be really significant for a lot of different reasons. But if I were a young person right now, the takeaway that I would have, well, if I were a younger person, let's say, the takeaway that I would have is go into tech. I do not think that tech is going to be a passing trend. I think that the more it appears to me that the physical world and the physical economy is becoming more and more unsustainable. You have these huge debt loads in most developed countries. You have a lot of individual people who are seeing their own financial situation get worse. And what that is that's happening at the same time as this digital world is expanding rapidly and bandwidth costs are coming down enormously. And the number of services that you can have over the internet is increasing very, very fast. And so from my perspective, the only logical conclusion is that people are going to be consuming more and more things online because online things tend to be cheaper. I mean, for example, you play in a virtual game and you want to buy a virtual shirt in that virtual game, the marginal cost for that game to make the virtual shirt is like zero. I mean, they pay the programmer to write the computer program to make the shirt, and then they have the shirt, and then it's just a copy and paste. It will never be that cheap to build a shirt in the physical world. I mean, it might get cheaper and cheaper as we get cheaper labor, but like it more automated factories, but like it will never be zero. And so again, I think like I don't know how many of you have seen the film Ready Player One, but like I sometimes think of that as kind of the near future in the sense that I don't think that the tech trend is one that's going to reverse itself anytime soon. I think that we're all going deeper and deeper into the matrix, and that's just how it is. So yeah, something to consider. And I think my last point here on the slide is jump into tech either with skill set or money. So I mean, in my case, for example, I don't have a lot of patience for computer science. I'm not very good with tech in general. And so I've just tried to get into the tech space by putting a lot of my net worth into tech, which is my kind of my way of hedging, I guess. And actually, this brings me back to a point that I forgot to mention on slide one, and I'll mention it now because it's a good anecdote. On the topic of personal investment, so I read a really great article at one point last year talking about you have two people, a hedge fund manager and a government employee. And as it relates to investment philosophy, the hedge fund manager is very aggressive. He has a lot of self-confidence. He puts a lot into stocks. And the government employee is very conservative, put all their money into bonds. And this is the exact opposite of what they should be doing. Because if you have a situation where the economy does very well, the hedge fund employee will get large bonuses. They will do very well. And also their portfolio will go up a lot. And the government employee in that situation will not see a large bonus because they get, government pay is quite stable. And if they're invested in bonds, they will also not see much of a performance in their portfolio. On the other side, if the economy does badly, the hedge fund employee will see their portfolio will go down, their bonus will go down, their whole life will become much less good. The government employee, on the other hand, their salary will remain quite stable. Their bonds will remain quite stable. They will do quite okay. the takeaway is that they should both be invested in the opposite thing. So if you're a government employee, you should be invested in assets that are higher risk because your job is not related really to the economic cycle. On the other hand, if your job is very much related to the economic cycle, like the hedge fund manager, you want to buy bonds because if the economy does well, you are going to get a large bonus. So you don't really care about your net worth, your salary, your 401k. And conversely, if the economy does badly, you may do badly with your work, but at least your bonds are safe. So again, not related necessarily to tech, but going back to my investment slide, that is something to think about, is trying to invest in things that are different from your main investment, which is the cash flow that you're getting from the fact that you're working. So again, with me, I don't really do very much in tech, and so I invest a lot of my money into tech, because if tech continues to do really well, at least I have most of my money in tech. Whereas if tech does very badly, well, I'm not really in tech, so I don't really care. So again, these are just some high level thoughts on tech, I guess, and investment more generally. So next point, the idea that the labor markets are flattening and it helps to not just be labor. And this is a kind of, it is a hard thing to make systematic, but I do think it's an important thing to consider. So labor markets are flattening. What does that mean? You're all, and I am competing with a lot more people now than we were competing with 10, 20, 30 years ago. We're competing with people that are willing to work for much less money than most people coming out of Illinois State University are willing to work for. And oftentimes we're competing with people who have like some pretty amazing skill sets or some pretty amazing perspectives that they bring. And it is becoming flatter and flatter every day. Every additional person that downloads Zoom is an additional person that is now able to communicate with anyone in the world in like relatively high definition video on the same platform that we're all using right now. So again, the labor market is getting flat, and it will help then to not just be labor. And what do I mean by this? So in Hong Kong, people here are obsessed with titles, with like certifications, with all the CFA, CPA, MBA, all these things. And you go on LinkedIn, and if you go on LinkedIn right now, and if you search for people located in Hong Kong, you will be astonished at the number of acronyms after people's names in their LinkedIn title, because honestly, everyone just loves their titles. And that's all fine, but the titles are very much a commodity, in the sense that if you have a title like CPA, everyone else in the CPA has the exact same title, and that title itself does not differentiate you at all, apart from the fact that it's a CPA. Okay, fine. I think the better thing to try to do, if you can do it, is to develop your own very specific niche that is really, really hard to fill. And the challenge is finding a niche that's like worth developing, that's can actually pay you money, but that is hard to have you be replaced. So like in my case, for example, and I've circled here on my LinkedIn, I do the space and aerospace industry consulting, and I spent a lot of time in China. So I speak Chinese. I have a lot of I have a big network in China in this industry. Being based in Hong Kong, it kind of allows me to work with Western companies. And so really I've kind of cornered the market on this like China space and aerospace industry consulting in, with Western companies kind of thing. Very, very niche. And I had when I was at ISU, I had never once ever thought about going into the space or aerospace industry. It never crossed my radar at any point. And yet here I am. And so I guess the takeaway is it has helped me immensely to have a brand and to have kind of a thing that has made me unique. So at conferences, for example, I moderate panels. And when I moderate panels, at the beginning or at the end, every single time I will say, and if you forget my name, if you don't know how to spell my name, just go on LinkedIn and search China Space Guy hashtag here, and you will definitely find me. And I have people do that. And I've met clients that way, where they found me because they remembered that I said China Space Guy, and that's kind of a dumb or memorable thing. And then they find you. And so again, it's not entirely straightforward how to systematically develop your own niche. It kind of depends on what your interests are and on what your, what your skills are. But certainly I recommend trying to develop a niche. And just, I was thinking about this yesterday when we were making this PowerPoint. like off the top of my head, I would think, just as an example, like ISU being in Normal, there's State Farm, and is it Countrywide is the other insurance, so big insurance industry at ISU in Normal. There's a lot of intellectual, how would you say? Well, there's a lot of people in the College of Business that really know insurance. There's a lot of insurance expertise in this university. At the same time, in China, there's a lot of demand for insurance. Like there is a huge hole in the market in China right now for more diverse types of insurance. So like I could imagine trying to find some connection between the insurance industry in Normal and the fact that China does not have a sufficiently diverse insurance sector. Again, this is just spitballing here, but basically the idea would be trying to find a niche, because otherwise it's going to get increasingly hard to compete in the global economy with just, I have this degree from this school, or I have this qualification. It's going to become just really quite competitive, I think. And also try to find some side hustles. I always recommend side hustles. When I was at ISU, I had a lot of little side hustles going on, and even still to this day. So that's always fun. So yeah, last point, to embrace probability-based flexibility. So what does that mean? Probability-based, I think not enough people appreciate the extent to which our lives are very probability-based. There's very, very, very few things that you can do that will lead to a certain outcome. If you want to become the CEO of a company, there is no one thing that you can do that will make you the CEO of that company. You need to do many things over a very long period of time, every single one of those things maybe being like a 55% chance to get you closer to being the CEO, and they all have to line up in a specific way for you to become CEO. There's no one thing that you can do unless you are literally like born into a family-owned business, and then someone dies and you become CEO. I don't know, but basically the idea is that life is a series of interactions, and that every one of those interactions will have some impact on sort of where you go from there. And there's a certain level of probability involved in all of this. And as I mentioned a moment ago, when I was at ISU, I had a lot of side hustles, and one of them back in the 2010s, online poker was still quite legal and very widely played, to where the quality of play was very, very bad. I made okay money at ISU playing online poker. And one thing that you learn very quickly playing online poker is that you play enough hands, you will find there are hands where you're a 99% chance to win and you lose, and find there are hands where you're a 99% chance to lose and you will win. And so again, life, I think, is much the same, where it's very probabilistic. You will very unlikely be 100% ever to win or to lose. And so that's something that I think is important to consider. And I think flexibility, the second part of this, is another underrated attribute, let's say. And again, as I mentioned here, this insurance program with ISU and sort of thinking flexibly there, but basically this idea of just seeing the world as, I guess, seeing the world as it is. Like what for example, I started traveling when I was quite young. I think my first time taking a solo trip would have been between my sophomore and junior year at ISU. I went to Turkey and the UK and Italy, a few other places. And I realized at that time, like, the world is quite small and that you can be quite flexible. I mean, I don't know how realistic it, well, I guess right now during COVID, it's not realistic, but next year, 2 years from now, I could imagine us being back to the point where you could, as an ISU graduate, get on an airplane and fly to some foreign country and just show up and try to find a job in that country, and it might very well work out. Like, that's literally what I did with China in 2011. And it worked out fine. Now, granted, that was a different time, but still, I think this flexibility is something that not enough courses talk about, because, you know, it doesn't really fall under any particular course, this, you know, probability-based flexibility. So conclusions. A couple of things that I would just kind of say to wrap up, and let me, do I have a picture? No, I don't. Okay. So I guess a lot depends on finding overlap. What does that mean? in the context of career, overlap is sort of, so for example, from 2011 till 2017, I worked for a US based company doing space and satellite consulting. I worked remotely, primarily in China. None of my work during that 6 years had anything to do with China, like zero projects. But I was living in China and I learned reasonably good Chinese during that time. And in general, I felt I had a pretty good understanding of China. And so in 2017, I said I wanted to pivot from space and satellite to kind of like China and aerospace and space and kind of strategic industries. And that pivot was really only made possible because there was this massive overlap in my life before that of like I was working in space and satellite while living in China. And the living in China had nothing to do with my job. It was really just kind of I liked living in China. And so this overlap was hugely beneficial. And so I recommend, finding areas where you can find an overlap. And the last point I will make here is a quote from Iris Varner, who told me this quote back in like 2007 in regard to her having hitchhiked from Germany to Baghdad when she was in college, I think. She said, you can do cool and fun things as long as you can find a way to make it fit in your resume. And I've always really kind of gone with that. I think it's a good, you can definitely do cool and fun things as long as it fits on your resume. So with that being said, I open the floor to questions or comments. I don't know if there have been any questions coming in. I haven't had the chat box open. Looks like no. But yeah, so I open the floor to questions or thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, if you guys want to go ahead and just send them in whenever you come up with them. Blaine, I was going to say, I know with a lot of us entering, our junior, senior years, I know we have a grad student in here as well. A lot of us, we come into college and you're looking to have a job offer ready by the time you graduate. Obviously, you had a very different strategy and process to get to the point where you are now with, your post-grad stuff. Can you just kind of talk about your mentality, I guess, coming out of college like that?
Sure. So I was coming out of ISU in summer of 2011, and I had, after graduation, I had lined up what was then called the Student Export Project, which was like a 1 month, sort of an internship-y kind of a thing where we went to Shanghai for this US company to do some research. And so after graduating, my plan was to do that until like mid-July of 2011, and then kind of see what the plan was. So I then came back to the US in mid-July. I applied for a bunch of jobs at that time, and I just didn't really find any jobs that were particularly inspiring and that were particularly, it was not a particularly inspiring experience. And so in, I guess, September of 2011, I moved back to Hong Kong. I had a friend here from my time on exchange, and he like had a couch, and he's like, you can stay on my couch for a while and just apply for jobs. And so I basically just moved back to Hong Kong and applied to jobs in Hong Kong and in Shenzhen, which is like a big city just over the border. And I found a job in Shenzhen, like, I don't know, about a month after getting here, I guess. So in that case, it was very, it was just kind of, get in an airplane and fly to Hong Kong with a suitcase and like $1,200 and kind of see how it goes. I guess in a kind of more practical sense, like if I'm advising someone who doesn't plan on just going out, getting an airplane going to Hong Kong, I still think probably like networking and going on, like, for example, going on LinkedIn, finding people in positions that are of interest to you, finding companies that are interesting to you, and actually having authentic conversations with people. Like, I mean, I think that the most important thing is finding something that you're interested in. I mean, this is, and this is something I didn't mention in the PowerPoint, but I think it's worth mentioning, is just the importance of authenticity in general. I mean, in everything in life, honestly, I listen to a crazy number of podcasts, more than I should. And by far the best ones are the ones where the host is authentic and where you can tell that what they're talking about it because they like it, not because they have to be here. And so again, if you're looking at the job market right now, and if you're thinking, what's the plan? I know it's not always immediately apparent, like what kind of job do I want after graduation? I had no idea. I still have no idea what I want to be when I grow up. I have no idea. But give it some thought. Think about what you like to do. Think about what gets you excited, and then try to put yourself in positions where you can be having professional conversations with people about those topics. Because again, the enthusiasm, the authenticity, that will show up in what you say and how you know. I mean, like, for example, if you're giving a job interview and the person that you're interviewing with clearly, you know, they might know their stuff, but if they have no interest about the topic, they're not going to look particularly enthusiastic. They're not probably going to ask follow-up questions. It's just, it might feel a bit less, well, authentic, for lack of a better term. So yeah, I mean, if getting on an airplane and flying to Hong Kong and just applying for jobs is not an option, then I think the next best thing is just, you know, think about what you like to do, what you like to think about, what you like to talk about, and then try to put yourself in positions where you are talking about those things in a professional context. And I think at a certain point, you will put yourself in a position to where, like, that authenticity will show up and people will take notice. I think. The other thing, and I don't know to what extent this really works, but I do it a lot myself, and I find it works in terms of like getting sales leads for my company, for example, is to read broadly and to be able to come up with random insightful ideas or points. So for example, again, I listen to way more podcasts than I should. I listen to a very diverse variety of podcasts. And so there could be a time where I'm talking with a bunch of people that are, like, I don't know, very much focused on like the real estate sector from a financial perspective. So like, you know, they're investing in real estate, and I might come up with some random fact about, like, I don't know, Japanese politics and how that might relate to like Japanese real estate currently, something like this. And it really, I think people seem to remember those kind of random facts if they are in fact relevant to what you're talking about. This idea of like being known, like I've had a couple of professors of strategy who have formerly been like strategy consultants, and they've always said that the most respected people in the firm are the ones who just have the most unique ideas, the ones who can you know, come up with ideas that are completely from out of left field. And I think the best way of doing that is to read broadly and to try to just expose yourself to as many different ideas as possible. I'm seeing a couple of questions coming in the group chat, so should I just kind of go? I'll kind of take these as they go. Is that?
Yeah, that's.
So we have yeah. So where did you get your international internship, and how did you get it from Sunshine? Thank you, Sunshine. Love the name. So international internship, I got mine in so through the international business department, but that was so basically an alumni from the IB program from maybe 1985 or so. He had since gone to work for a satellite operator in the Netherlands, and so he then arranged for an internship at that satellite operator in the Netherlands, and then he had contacted the IB department, again, this is 10 years ago, and asked them to have some students apply. And so then how did I get it? Actually, so for that, and this is another, to the point about like reading broadly. So that internship, about 12 international business majors applied. I was the only junior to apply. The rest were seniors. And I don't know, I at the time I was shocked to have gotten the internship. I went to the Netherlands that summer. I got drunk one night with my mentor at the internship, the guy who had interviewed me. And when we were drunk, I said, man, like, why did I get this internship? I was, you know, what was it that that set me apart? And he said, well, you know, to be honest, like all of your interviews were broadly pretty similar, except that at the end of your interview, you asked us some interesting questions about Russia compared to Western Europe. And like, you know, how does the geopolitical situation make business different in Russia? And that was what set you apart from, you know, the other people were asking, like, what's the office environment like? And like, you know, what's the, are there like casual Fridays, this kind of thing. So how did I get it? According to my mentor when drunk, he said that it was because I asked about, you know, Russia as opposed to casual Fridays. How has COVID-19 impacted the space industry? Do you know any Chinese prior to visiting China? That's from Abigail. Thank you, Abigail. So did I know any Chinese prior to visiting China? No, I did not. How has COVID impacted the space industry? Honestly, I think it has been a good thing for the industry for two reasons. So one, as Earth becomes more of a shit show, people spend more money trying to get off of Earth, I suppose. And I say that partly jokingly, but like partly seriously. Like there's a lot more money being put into like kind of big rocket type efforts and this kind of thing. But then also I think because as connectivity has become more important now, and as people are staying home and I get, well, connectivity being more important, a lot of sites are providing broadband service, and the price of that is coming down, and so there's kind of this interesting multiple factors playing into the favor of satellite broadband. So overall, COVID has actually probably been a benefit for the space industry. Question from Julia: do you need a work permit to apply for citizenship to work in Hong Kong? Yes. So Hong Kong is a little bit on the rather more difficult side, I guess, to get a work permit. So basically in Hong Kong, you would need to either come here and do like a master's program for 1 year, like a full-time master's program. And then after graduate, so that would get you a 1 year student visa. And then after graduating, you would get what's called an IANG visa, which basically lets you get on the job ladder. So as a foreigner who would want to come and work in Hong Kong, I would say the easiest way, the most certain way, is come here for a 1 year master's program and then get on the job ladder that way. The other way of doing it would be to find a company that is willing to hire you in Hong Kong. They would need to then prove to the Hong Kong government that they could not find a local for this position that they're hiring you for. And then they would basically sponsor your work visa. And that's a fairly straightforward process once you do find a company that's willing to sponsor your visa. So question from Trevor: what are some of your favorite podcasts? So that's a good one. So for finance, I would listen to, there's a podcast called QTR, Quoth the Raven Research, which is a really good one, a little bit libertarian, but very, very interesting podcast. I listen to The Intelligence from The Economist. It's like a daily news podcast, which is quite good. And then I listen to a lot of China podcasts. So like there's the China Africa Talk, which is pretty good. There's the Caixin Global Business Weekly kind of thing. But yeah, I'll follow up an email with a few other podcasts because there's a good one. What's your opinion on investing in green energy, from Brandon? Investing in green energy is an interesting question. So I think green energy in general is going to be a big thing in the future. I mean, if you look at, so my feeling is that if we look at human needs, it is starting to converge on a very small number of things. Like the only thing that most humans need now is like bandwidth and electricity for your devices, and like basic clothes and food. And like honestly, if you were to be told that you don't have bandwidth or that you don't have electricity, I assume that those would be like deal breaker. Like those are probably the two most essential things. So if we think about that, then, you know, okay, bandwidth, fine. So internet service providers, like that's going to be a business that's not going to go away, and that's probably going to change dramatically, partly because of space. There's a lot of people wanting to launch satellites for internet access that are like global. But the other element of that, energy, is going to be an industry that changes quite radically, I think, in the future, because I do think energy is going to be, well, yeah, it's going to change really quite radically. Investing in green energy, though, I tend to be skeptical. Honestly, I think any industry that has such a large portion of the business model, at least initially based on subsidies, it kind of lends itself to people who are only going for the subsidies to some extent. Like I don't know if that's true, and there has not been a lot of well, I have not read that much research about this, but my feeling, like for example, I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk, to be entirely honest with you. I think he's kind of a snake oil salesman, like the biggest snake oil salesman of all. And I think that a lot of that kind of, again, like going for the subsidies, it's quite prevalent in a lot of green energy, and so it makes it rather hard to discern which of these companies are being run by kind of like snake oil salesmen that are just really in it for the subsidies, and which of these companies are actually doing like really innovative technology. And as someone who doesn't really know that much about the technology side, I don't really have a lot of faith in my own ability to pick the winners in that industry. But I do think in general, like when I think about, again, not being a big fan of Elon Musk, when I look at what Tesla is doing with batteries, I think it's quite exciting. Because when you think about what it could mean in the future if you had like really like high density batteries. If you could like carry around a battery with you that's like as big as your smartphone that could like power your house for a day or something, and then you could just recharge it, and like that degree of you could call it portability of energy would be really pretty interesting. And I don't know how far we are from that, but it's on the horizon, I think. So yeah, it's an interesting industry. I don't know that much about investing in it. Question from Keaton: what are your thoughts on the U.S. Space Force? Does China have anything like this? If not, what do you think? Yeah, this is a good. The U.S., China, and space is an interesting question. So first, my thoughts on the Space Force. I mean, I think it makes sense. So prior to the Space Force, most of the U.S. military activity related to space was handled under the Air Force, and so basically what they've done now is they've said, okay, well, space is a different enough thing. It involves enough kind of specialization. It involves enough differentiation to where we're going to carve it out, have it be a separate thing. And conceptually, like that seems sensible. Like space seems to be an industry that is growing and that is becoming more important, let's say. Does China have anything like this? So China's space program compared to the US is, it's more centralized, it's more state controlled. So in the US, I mean, up until the, let's say 90s, the US space industry was also quite state controlled, but now we've seen a lot of private companies coming out and doing really interesting things. And in China, you're starting to see that, but it's much slower of a process. And this gets to an interesting point about the Chinese system more broadly, and I think it's going to be a challenge in China moving forward. This idea that in many industries in China, you have a big state-owned monopolist that has a lot of power and that does not want to see the industry change. And everyone else wants to see the industry change. So an example would be the rocket industry in China. Right now, there's like a few big companies that make rockets. They're all state-owned. Mostly they're part of the same group of companies, and they have a monopoly on rockets. And so they don't want any commercial rocket companies to be coming into China. Like they'd be very pissed if a Chinese version of SpaceX were to come out, because again, they have a monopoly right now. And so even if the Chinese version of SpaceX grew the market, even if it brought more interest, it still means they don't have a monopoly. And so you have a situation where what might be better for the public, what might be better for the economy, what might be better for China, which is like more open industry, is worse for the one company that has a lot of power to stop that from happening. And with something like rockets, it's a little bit trivial, because really, like, does that have a big impact on like everyday life? Probably not. But if you go into something like telecoms, like there's 3 big telecom companies in China. There are only 3. They're all state-owned. They all have, like 3 to 500 million subscribers, and they're all pretty like fat and dumb and happy, to be honest with you. And so none of them really want to see any kind of like reform in the telecoms industry, even if for an average person, reform might be quite okay. So I think the broader point that this gets at in the Chinese system is it's very hard to innovate in certain industries where there's a big state-owned incumbent. And that's going to become a problem in industries that are like, really requiring innovation. So again, like in space, if you look at the type of things that SpaceX is doing right now in terms of innovation, they are running circles around China, partly because Elon Musk just doesn't give a shit. Like he is his own boss, for lack of a better term. He does not, there is no incumbent that is saying, Elon Musk, you can and cannot do this. And in China, there is very much an incumbent that is saying, private companies, you can or cannot do this. And I think that's going to be a challenge in terms of finding a way to foster real disruptive innovation without without taking away the power of these monopolists. Yeah. So question from Samuel Welker. Other than reading broadly, how do you go about being up to date on current events in international business? And did you go to any school after graduating from ISU? Good question. So up to date on current events in international business, I read, so the one magazine that I subscribe to is The Economist. I read The Economist every single week. It is the best, like in terms of 100 per week magazine, is the been, I've found, in terms of just giving you a global perspective. And there's section finance and economics, section on technology, and it's just a very, very good overview of what's going on. The Economist pretty much have to cover every week. I read a lot of other, Financial Times. I those are probably the two, but then Bloomberg and a few others. And then I talk to people a lot. So like the first question I ask most people when I meet them is, where are they from? And I talk to them about where they're from, and like probably I've been to where they're from or I've heard of it. And then I try to talk a little bit about the politics of where they're from, and just kind of try to get their perspectives from this person who's actually from the place. And if you do that for like 10 or 15 or 20 years, and if you're doing that with enough people from enough places, you will quickly find that you have this kind of mental map of the way that things are pretty much set up. And I mean, obviously you're learning all the time, so it's never a fully well-defined map. But yeah, I think talking to people is a good way of figuring things out. Question from Trevor: given the current political climate in the West, China is villainized. Can you point out some positive things that you admire about the Chinese Eastern business strategies, things we could learn? Very good question. One thing that I think is really interesting to look at in China today compared to the West is the idea of a sense of like citizenship, or a sense of like, I guess, a higher. Well, okay, so for right now, the political situation in the US is disturbing. I think whether you're Republican or Democrat, you can agree it is a disturbing situation. And it's disturbing for a lot of reasons, but I think the most disturbing thing is that people on opposite sides just don't even talk to each other in general. And there's because things are so polarized, it's very, very, very hard for someone to feel like I'm doing this thing for the greater good of the whole United States, because there is no cohesive whole United States anymore. Like, it's very hard to do something that is good for both Democrats and Republicans right now, in the sense that they have such different wants and needs that it's become such a split thing. And in China, you still have this really deep, a lot of people have this deep kind of like, I want to do something because I want to make China better. And I want to, there's certain patriotism, I guess. And this is really, I think, important in industries like in tech industries, for example. I think it's a little bit dangerous to have a company like Amazon or like Apple or like Microsoft having like zero loyalty, we could say, to the US, in terms of, if they wanted to move their headquarters, they could. If they don't pay taxes, like, they don't really give a shit about the average American, I don't think. And no, I mean, frankly speaking, like, the incentive system is such to where they have no reason to. Like, it's not to say that Amazon is a bad company or they're bad people for this. It's just that, like, we in the US have this very clear idea of there's the economy and there's society, and never shall the two meet, sort of thing. And I think in China, you have just a much greater sense of like unity, and of people actually doing things because they want to make their society better or their country better, this kind of thing. And I think it's a powerful thing. It's a powerful motivator. And I think it's going to become more important as we see the US become more and more kind of polarized. I think that's going to be a bigger factor in China. Other things I think that are really interesting about China that we don't see as much in the West, it's like long-term planning. Like, they have, the government, so the central government has their 5-year plans, and these are well publicized. And the next one is going to be published later this year for 2021, 2025. But then even like the provincial governments, the city governments, they have their own 2 or 3 or 5-year plans, and it's all it's pretty well organized, and there's a pretty kind of coherent strategy. And there's a lot of like kind of just respect for process and for bureaucracy and for kind of the way things are done. And that can be a bad thing if done to too much of an extent. But again, I think especially when compared to the US right now, where there's just like such an absence of respect for process, or for just for like politics that are not toxic even. I think it's an interesting element of China that we see. Yeah, so those are probably the two things: is this sort of long-term orientation, and this idea that you still have a lot of people who are quite, motivated by making their country better. I think, and I think, I mean, part of that, and I say this sometimes, and when I say it, I laugh at myself sometimes because it sounds kind of crazy, but it also sounds reasonably correct, is that China feels a lot like the US might have felt in like the 60s, in the sense that like in the US in the 60s, I'm pretty sure people still left their front door unlocked when they went outside. Like, everyone knew their neighbor, everyone felt quite, you know, like we have a community here, and that we're all kind of on the same page. And I think in the US over the last 20, 30, 50 years, that has changed. And I think in China you still have that feeling, and that's an interesting difference. Another question from Trevor: where do you call home after being an expat for an extended period of your life? Is there anything you miss about the US, your favorite thing to do? So where do I call home? That's a good question. Honestly, probably Hong Kong at this point. Hong Kong is it's a pretty cool place. I feel quite at home here. I mean, there's certain things about here that are not so homey, but overall Hong Kong is home. And after being an expat for an extended period of time, is there anything you miss about the US? Yeah, so there's the US ends up becoming a very funny place when you're away for a very long time. You go back and you wonder, why is everyone so loud, and why is everyone so big, and why is there so much space, and why is everything so cheap? Everything is so cheap. Jesus Christ. When I get back to O'Hare, it's like everything is so cheap. Food especially is just unbelievably cheap. So what do I miss? I miss the one thing I do really like about the US and about Americans in general is that you always feel like you are having a conversation with them at a very human level. In Hong Kong, people can feel kind of like algorithms sometimes, in the sense that there's a lot of kind of canned responses that you get. And in the US, it feels like most of the time when you're talking to somebody, they're letting their guard down a little bit. They're being pretty straightforward with you. And I like that very much. I miss the straightforwardness about Americans. That's, yeah. Yeah, so I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I'm happy to discuss if there's any verbal questions or talking points. I'm happy to.
I actually had a question, and first of all, I really enjoyed the talk. It was interesting, but so kind of to go along with Trevor's question of working in China or with China, like there's an episode of South Park where they kind of portray like when American companies work with China, they kind of have to like push their morals to the side to do business there. Like, how accurate do you think that representation is?
That is a great episode, and I'm glad that there was a reference to that episode on this during this talk. That's good. It's accurate. I mean, it's pretty much accurate. So I mean, for example, I mean, we see. So recently, for example, there have been instances where, like, I think Marriott hotels a couple of years ago, they had on a drop-down menu. So they have, the country option on their website. So you pick a country, and in their drop-down menu under countries, they had Taiwan. And China made a huge thing about this, and they they threatened to like take away Marriott's business license in China. Like it was a really big thing because it's Taiwan should not be a country on your website. So there's definitely, I mean, so there's a few issues I think in China that are like definitely like no go, and Taiwan is definitely one of them. Where if you make any comment about Taiwan in China, in particular, if it's Taiwan independence or anything like this, it becomes very sticky very fast. In my experience, like the most, I guess the most like apparent way that I've noticed this is that I just don't really talk politics in China. Like I've never had any instance. I have a Chinese business partner in Beijing, and I've known him for a few years. We've had a lot of conversations about a lot of things, but I'm very careful to not say certain things, which is, I mean, basically it amounts to self-censorship, which is not ideal. But it is just, I guess to your question, it is a reality of doing business in China, is that you do need to be a little bit careful about some topics. Because honestly, that is one thing that I guess it does still to this day strike me a little bit about mainland China and about Chinese people in general. And it certainly struck me initially when I first got there, is that there's still, there's a lot of sensitivity around a few specific topics. And again, like it can devolve very quickly if you get into those certain topics. So yeah, I think it's a fair, as is usually the case in South Park. You know, it might be a little bit exaggerated, but overall it's perfectly fair in terms of their interpretation of what happened. It's unfortunate, but yeah, it's a pretty fair episode, I think. Question from Trevor in the chat. So saying, I went to ISU during the Great Recession. Did I know classmates who were impacted by this? And is this applicable to today? So I think that's a really good question. So yeah, the Great Recession would have occurred like my sophomore, junior year at ISU, and then probably, I guess, still as I was graduating, maybe in 2011. And yeah, I think it definitely does. I mean, it's probably bad luck to be coming into a job market at a time when the economy is not doing well, in the sense that you are just have. I mean, it goes back to the idea, the sort of probability based way of looking at life. It's just sort of like, okay, well, you know, your expected value, let's say, is now slightly less than it may have otherwise been, and that's a reality, and that's bad luck, I suppose, would be the best way of describing it. But I do think at the end of the day, like it still is a question of, you know, one's own resourcefulness and one's own trying to create this niche and finding a way to make something work. But yeah, and so in terms of, did I know anyone who was impacted by the Great Recession, or I don't think so. No, I mean, when I graduated, most of my friends at ISU were from the IB program, and most of them found, you know, kind of niche IB type jobs after graduation, I think. But yeah, today, certainly, I mean, I think it must be a difficult job market today. And this is where I do think side hustles and personal branding and like just finding a topic that you like to talk about and starting to create content about the topic. Like for example, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would venture to say there's a decent number of people in mainland China. And when I say decent number, that could mean like 1 million people. I don't know. But people who would be interested in, you know, what is life like in the corn belt of the US, like it's cornfields. Like, I mean, there's a Twitter guy there's a Twitter personality that I follow. He's from Hebei, a province outside of Beijing, and he's called like Hebei Pangzai, which means like the fat guy from Hebei. And his Twitter bio is literally just like, I'm an ordinary peasant from Hebei province. And he's just this fat bald guy who just like does this way of drinking beer where he has a big bottle of beer and he'll do like a tornado kind of motion and then put it upside down like this, and he drinks it so fast, how fast this guy drinks his beer. It's unbelievable. And the guy has like 200,000 Twitter followers as literally just ordinary Chinese peasant. If you look, this guy Hebei Pangzai, if you look him up on Twitter, and he gives you this really interesting insight into like it's not average life in rural China. I don't think average people are doing tornado beers every 10 minutes, but still, there's this idea of like some Chinese guy who's just some guy who lives in a rural part of China, and this is what life is like there. And I don't know how much money you make with 200,000 Twitter followers, but like I assume there's a monetization going on there of some kind. I assume that guy is no longer an ordinary Chinese peasant. And so yeah, you know, it's a crazy world. Like you never know what's going to stick, I guess. And that's a great Twitter follow. If you guys are interested in like ordinary China, that's a pretty fun guy to follow on Twitter. Keaton knows what's up. Yeah. He loves that guy. Cool. All right. Well, again, if there's any other topics to discuss, I'm happy to discuss. Otherwise, I'm always available on LinkedIn or email or you know, any other. There's the internet, so a lot of ways to find me.
Yeah, absolutely, Blaine. Thank you so much for coming in tonight. We really appreciate it. It was fantastic. Trevor says shout out to PGN. Shout out to IBA as well. Thank you guys for coming out, and everybody else that joined this call. Blaine, thank you so much for your time. Before you guys go, can we get a quick screenshot of this? Blaine, are you able to stop sharing your screen for a second?
Yes, I will stop sharing my screen. Oh yeah, there we go.
So
and now we got one. Nice. Cool.
Just take a screenshot real quick. All right. Let's go.
All right. thank you all for your time and taking a Wednesday night to chat with me. It was good talk. And again, by all means, be in touch. Happy to hear from you.
Thanks again, Blaine. Have a good night, everybody.
Cool.
Thank you.
Bye.